Welcome to the Science Studio. We're actually at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography today in La Jolla, California. The Scripps Nuremberg Prize was awarded last night to our guest, Richard Dawkins. Richard is a well-known evolutionary biologist, just finished as Charles Simonyi Professor for the Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford, and a well-known author, obviously, of books from The Selfish Gene through The Blind Watchmaker to The God Delusion, and his new book, which we'll talk about in a moment. But welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
New book is called?
The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. It was supposed to be called Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth, the Only Game in Town, which was a slogan on a t-shirt that somebody sent me, but the publishers wouldn't go for the second part, so it's limited to The Greatest Show on Earth.
All right. Now, I mentioned we're at Scripps. The former director of Scripps and the half of the prize name that you got, Bill Nuremberg, was also a great communicator of science, and I'm just thinking that you're in great company in winning this prize. If you look at the list of the folks who got it, I'm just checking now, it's Ed Wilson.
Pretty good list.
David Attenborough, Jane Lubchenco, who's now the administrator of NOAA, Walter Cronkite.
Yeah. Jane Goodall, Craig Venter, James Hansen. Two climate people in there, incidentally, and we are at a place where a lot of the original work has been done that contributes to the whole global warming issue. This is slightly a curve for you, but only in the sense that global warming is one of the important issues in science and social policy at this point. And we have now an administration where the president has said that he wants to restore science to its rightful place on the US agenda, and a leader of the House who says that her agenda can be expressed in 4 words: science, 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 and science. Can we just lead off by some comment on the whole the state of science, relationship to policy? And so I'm delighted that, that we now do have an administration that takes science seriously, treats science with respect, and it's about time. I mean, we've had 4 years, science has been in the wilderness for 8 years indeed. Mm-hmm. So that's extremely welcome. On the matter of global warming, and it's obviously an extremely important issue, it's one that's very hard for lay people to evaluate. It's very complicated, involves complicated model building, and lots of different experts involved in their different spheres. That does make it hard, because it means that to some extent we who are not versed in the details have to take on trust what experts tell us, and that's always risky. It's not what scientists like to do, and they like to sort of evaluate it for themselves. But inevitably, scientists in one field have to say, well, we trust our colleagues in other fields to be getting their sums right and doing their modelling right and things. But that does make it a little bit awkward. It means that I'm not being a climatologist. I don't feel able to speak with the same authority that I could speak with in, say, evolutionary biology.
Yeah, we sort of had a conversation about this a few days ago in Arizona at the Origins Initiative. This dichotomy between, on the one hand, a public that would like to have a definitive answer to things and thinks that that's what science delivers, and the reality of science. In communicating, in your job as Simonyi Professor, did you find that was one of the issues that you had to be constantly...
Yes, it is difficult. I mean, and the way I put it is that I'm not qualified to tell you anything about physics. I'm probably qualified to interrogate a physicist and to pose interesting questions to a physicist, but I can't speak with any authority on physics. And I suppose that a layperson who doesn't know any science at all does tend to think, well, I need to get an authoritative opinion on everything. I need to know, is this true or isn't it true? And they don't take kindly. Politicians don't take kindly to being told, well, sir, it's a bit uncertain. Some people think this, some people think that. The evidence isn't yet all in. But unfortunately, that's the reality of the world.
Did people make that argument to you when you got into the God business? I mean, what do you know about that?
Well, they did, but I mean, I'm less impressed with that because although there is a subject called theology, which when you have professors of theology, I mean, there are some professors of theology who do interesting things like studying ancient documents, I mean, Hebrew documents and things, and others who study history of biblical lands. But theology itself, the study of God, the study of
the Trinity or the transubstantiation. That seems to me not to be a subject where you can legitimately call yourself an authority. There is nothing there to be an authority on, and therefore I don't feel impressed by the argument when it's applied to me there.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a moment and circle around to it. Can we just go back to, very quickly, beginnings? Your family, was there a scientific, religious background? What? Born in?
My father read botany at Oxford. I read zoology at Oxford. So we had similar educational backgrounds. He was, still is, very keen on nature and wildflowers and things. Taught my sister and me the names of flowers. My mother, too, was knowledgeable about that. I suppose I therefore had a sort of scientific background, not a religious background at home, a religious background at school. I was sent to ordinary Church of England schools and was made to go to chapel every Sunday and got confirmed and did the whole thing as a boy.
I mean, that's a fairly typically English story, because and my memory is that the requirement for there being RI, as it was known, religious instruction in the schools, was in fact part of a suggestion put forward by T.H. Huxley, of all people, when he was running the London...
I wasn't aware of that, but I'm not totally surprised, because it does seem to me to be educationally valuable that children should be taught about religion, which I imagine was Huxley's idea. Yeah. If you teach children about religion, as opposed to teaching them a particular religion, you don't teach them, you shouldn't teach them such and such is true about the world, about God. You should teach them there are people called Christians who believe this, and there are people called Muslims who believe that, and people called Hindus who believe the other. And the implication then is, and you can look them over and make your choice, or indeed decide to choose none of them. I think that a proper program of education in comparative religion would sound the death knell of religion, probably even more surely than a proper education in science, and I'm all for both.
One of the questioners after your lecture last night, this is the same point, essentially said, look, I'm a Christian, I would like to impart Christian values to my children. What right do you have to dictate to me that I shouldn't do that? And your response was to say, in fact, that you weren't dictating to him, but that you thought that he ought to offer the opportunity to his children.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the rights of a parent to teach their children whatever they like, but what about the rights of children? We already accept the principle that there are certain things parents do not have a right to do to their children. They can't beat them black and blue, they can't knock their teeth out, they can't be cruel to them. The state even steps in and takes children away when that happens. I'm not advocating that in the case of religious indoctrination, but at least that shows that we accept the principle that parents don't have an absolute right over their children, and children are people too. They have a right to learn, to be exposed to all that humanity has to offer, which includes science. And if there are parents who deliberately deprive their children of the opportunity to learn all the wonderful things we now know about the world, then that is a serious deprivation. I think that's a form of child abuse. And I'm not necessarily advocating that the state should step in and force the parents to educate them properly, but it's certainly worth thinking about.
Going back to your childhood, you actually grew up in Kenya?
Well, no, I was there for 2 years, and then moved to... No, that's right, and then moved to Malawi, which was where that was then Nyasaland, which was where my father's career was. And so that I do remember, and have been back there. That's just sort of further down, and it's a similar country, but rather poorer, rather well populated.
Well, let me check something with you, because one reads the background, the stories can often be wrong. It sounds as though there was already your father's influence would possibly send you in the scientific direction. You're growing up in an interesting area, naturalistically. But I read that, in fact, you weren't particularly interested as a boy in the naturalist side.
Well, that's true. I mean, when I was at, when I look at my fellow students who reading zoology, if you ask them how most of them got into it, many of them would have been bird watchers or bug hunters or butterfly collectors or wildflower
Kind of
pressers.
Darwin and Wallace types.
Yes, Darwin and Wallace types. Compared with them, I was more interested in the sort of questions of existence, the contributions that biology can make to, I suppose, philosophy. It's not that I was positively anti-natural history. I just wasn't quite so. I'm not a good natural historian, but I'm probably, you know, a bit above average. But I'm far below the average of professional zoologists, who are nearly all better naturalists than I am.
So this intrigues me, because you were interested in the why questions, which, as your lecture last night, you were basically saying, look, we do the how stuff very well. The why stuff, that's
No, I think we do the why stuff pretty well. At least, if anybody does the why questions, we do. I mean, I think my main point would be why questions are either illegitimate questions, like what is the colour of jealousy? That's an illegitimate question. To the extent that why questions have an answer at all, science is going to be the subject that finds them. And certainly theology isn't. I mean, there aren't any rivals to answer why questions.
Was there some pivotal point that made you decide to go and actually do science at university? Was there a teacher?
I suppose at the age of about 15 or 16, in the school system which I think you were in, you had to make a choice. You couldn't both do science and do, say, history. And I more or less drifted into biology. It was, I wouldn't say I was wildly interested in it. I was I wasn't that good at school, and I was sort of more interested in biology than in anything else. And so it was a kind of drifting in, partly perhaps my father's influence. I didn't really become deeply fascinated by it until my second year at university.
And there was something that...
It was the subject itself, I think, aided by the tutorial system, which is unique to Oxford and Cambridge,
right,
where you, instead of being lectured to and then going to practical classes and sort of having to meet a required standard in exams in which it was assumed that there was a body of knowledge that you had to learn. The essence of the tutorials, at least that I experienced with Oxford tutors, was that you were given an essay each week, which was often on a controversial topic, which you were supposed to come up with a view on, having devoted the entire week to going into the library and reading up all the original literature, all the original research papers in the original journals on this topic. So this is a very heady experience for a 19-year-old to be, in effect, as near to a world authority as you could become in a week. And you probably ended up knowing more about it than your tutor in certain cases, because although he had spent time reading it up, he wasn't so up to date because you'd just been in the library for that week learning it up. And not learning it, reading it, digesting it, sleeping, dreaming it in some cases, including mine. So when I came to write the essay, I was kind of temporarily obsessed with this subject. It was coming out of my ears. That's a very unusual experience. It's totally different from the experience of a student who says, oh, I'm taking biology 213 or whatever it is, and I'm taking genetics, and so I'm learning the requirement to pass the exam in genetics. It wasn't like that at all. It was write an essay on the controversy between Fisher and Wright on genetic drift, and so you would read the original papers and evaluate it as a scholar.
I found, don't want to sound like we're complaining about the difficulties of the modern system, but I have found in talking to classes of students recently that one of the things that seems to be missing enormously is history of science.
Yes.
So there's no context for what they're doing. Is that sort of the point you're making as well?
Not quite. I mean, that would be another way of making the same point, I think. But it's a different point. I'm not one who thinks that for every question you need to go back to the Greeks and you know, start with Aristotle and things. I find that nothing wrong with that, but it usually doesn't help you very much.
Right. So
there's a big turning point. You go to Berkeley at some point, right? You graduate from Oxford. At some point you go to Berkeley.
I went to Berkeley as a very young assistant professor at the age of about 26. And this was my first job. It was very exciting, totally new place. I mean, you know, something like where we are now.
Yeah.
And intellectually exciting, politically exciting. It was a very tempestuous time in American politics. This was the Lyndon Johnson years. This was the Vietnam War protest years, and Berkeley was in the thick of it. And so it was an interesting time. And I only stayed there 2 years, and then was, I suppose, lured back to Oxford by a wonderful offer I couldn't refuse.
How does the selfish gene is really the thing that's you're associated with a great deal, although I think you prefer the book that followed it, The Extended Phenotype. But Selfish Gene came out in 1976.
Yes.
What was the stimulus for that? Where did you get the idea? What was going on?
My own research wasn't on evolution, but much of my preoccupation as an undergraduate writing essays had been on evolution, and I never lost that interest. There was a spate of popular books in the 1960s and early 70s which committed what I regarded as the grave fallacy of group selectionism in explaining the very important question of altruism, cooperation, and how that evolves. And I wanted to write a book to explain what I thought was the correct interpretation of Darwinian natural selection, the level of the gene. I'd started lecturing on this topic in Oxford, actually, before I went to Berkeley. I stood in for Nico Tinbergen when he went on sabbatical. And I was at that time very excited by the papers of W.D. Hamilton on what's called kin selection, and which kind of became the centerpiece of the selfish gene 10 years later. And so I based several of my lectures to the Oxford students on Hamilton. And then when I went to Berkeley, I did the same thing. And then went back to Oxford and carried on with my research, which was nothing to do with any of this. Then there was a power strike. There was a thing called the 3-day week, which was under in the time of Grocer Heath's prime ministership.
Prime Minister Edward Heath.
Yes,
right.
That's right. And at the height of the crisis, there was the electricity was completely cut off for great swathes of time every week, so I couldn't do my lab research. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, now's the time to write this book that I've been nurturing. And so I wrote, I think, one chapter, which was pretty much the first chapter of The Selfish Gene. In about 1972, presumably one can look up when the 3-day week was. It might have been 73, I can't remember. And then the strike was over and the electricity came back on, and so I dropped it and just put it away in a drawer. And then I got a sabbatical leave in 1975, specifically to finish the book. And by that time, there was more than just Hamilton on the scene. There was Trivers, there was Maynard Smith, mm-hmm. and so I put it into what I think was a fairly coherent view of natural selection at the level of the gene, as opposed to the level of the individual, and certainly as opposed to the level of the group, and published it in 1976.
Okay, there's a full circle here, and obviously it's getting into too much depth would be difficult. But I remember Bob Trivers, who I think wrote the introduction, the foreword to The Selfish Gene, talking to Bob about how he went through this kind of a transformation himself, sitting there trying to figure out whether kin selection, a la Hamilton, or group selection, Vera Wynne Edwards' version of things, was the more accurate, and going back and forth, finally having a sort of a revelatory experience and deciding that he was going to go with the kin selection idea. We are now 30-some years on, having gone through the sociobiology phase of E.O. Wilson and so on. And now Ed himself, E.O. Wilson himself, David Sloan Wilson, are espousing a kind of return to group selection. Do you want to comment? Does that strike you?
I think they're just confused. I mean, you rightly cite Wynne Edwards for group selection. That was the group selection that we destroyed, and it various other mechanisms which really work at a genetic level. The so-called new group selection is just kin selection, or in some cases reciprocal altruism, under another name. For reasons best known to himself, which I can't understand, D.S. Wilson thinks it's helpful to rephrase it in terms of group selection. How it can be helpful when he's reviving a word which has been debunked and simply grafting that word onto the very thing that did the debunking, namely kin selection and reciprocal altruism and various other things. It seems to me to be utterly unhelpful, to be totally misleading to students, and it's deeply regrettable that E.O. Wilson should have teamed up with him in this way.
Do you think that one of the reasons for this, that underpinning some of this is a deep revulsion that some people still have at the rather harsh aspects that come to morality and so on if you're espousing a completely kin-selection view?
I have too much respect for E.O. Wilson to suggest that he would be motivated by that kind of reasoning. I mean, it may be. I'm sure you're right for certain people, but science, after all, is science. It's the science of what's true. It's the study of what's true, and it doesn't matter if it's disagreeable. It doesn't actually have to be disagreeable, because the fact is that humans are, in many cases, nice and loving and cooperative, and we don't have to obey. We don't have to behave in a ruthless way. I mean, the main message of the selfish gene actually was that genes may be selfish. They have to be selfish. That's sort of almost part of the definition of how natural selection works. But in the course of selfish genes acting in order to promote their self-interest through the generations, they may very well program altruistic behavior at the level of the individual, as I mentioned, kin selection, reciprocation, and so on. And those are robust theories. They work, and they can be generalized sort of by the cuckoo principle, that sometimes mistakes are made, so that altruism, which originally was selected in humans during a time when kin relations were very important, generalize to people in general. So that's why we give money to Oxfam and feel empathy towards people who are suffering and so on. We can devise a perfectly good theory which frees us from the need to feel all pessimistic about human nature. But even if it didn't free us from the need to be pessimistic about human nature, fretting about human nature is no reason to change our science. Science is the science of the truth.
I noticed, I made some notes last night from the lecture that you gave. Let me just take a quick look. You were talking, in fact, about some of the things that we now do are subversions of the original machinery, in a sense, so that we have goal subversions, and subversions of parental care would be the liking for pets and so on, or subversion of...
Yes. Well, subversion, that's what I meant by the cuckoo principle. Subversion is the way out of feeling pessimistic about all these things. I mean, we are a highly subverted species. Even if our ancestors were selfish and ruthless, when even they didn't have to be because of the kin selection, etc. But we are highly subverted, so we actually can be, many of us are, really rather nice. But perhaps I should, before leaving the Ed Wilson thing, I should say, I mean, he's talking specifically about ants, which he, of course, knows better than anybody, and is sort of tempted to say he wants to reintroduce a kind of group selection, because he's looking comparatively at what it is that led to certain groups of insects becoming eusocial and others not, and is saying that you can't get a good handle on explaining which groups went social by thinking purely in terms of the coefficient of relationship, the fraction of genes held in common between individuals. Therefore, he's looking for other things. I have no problem with that whatever. I mean, that's still covered by Hamilton's rule, because Hamilton's rule says that a gene will spread if RB is greater than C, if the benefit devalued by the coefficient of relationship is greater than the cost. And you mustn't forget B and C. And of course, B and C are very important. Benefit and cost, these are economic variables which are very important, interacting with coefficient of relationship. But you can't get away from it when you're trying to explain, as Darwin did, things like how can worker adaptations in ants, the huge jaws of soldiers, or the flat front of the heads of trapdoor ants, I mean, these are worker characteristics which are not present in reproductives, and yet they're passed on from generation to generation, even though the individuals that manifest these qualities are all sterile. The only way to explain that is the way Darwin explained it, and it is indeed kin selection. Darwin didn't say that, but it's the same genes express themselves differently in different individuals. They express themselves in workers as massive jaws or as flat fronts to the head. And they express themselves in queens or males in other ways. But the gene in a queen is favored because copies of the same gene in reproductives, in young queens and young males, is protected by the massive jaws which are made by the same gene in the soldiers. That's not group selection. That's gene selection. The whole thing is gene selection. Everything in Darwinism is gene selection. And it's just unhelpful and confusing for somebody as influential as Ed Wilson to suddenly turn around and say he started thinking about group selection again. What's he thinking of? It's confusing the issue like this.
Tell me something, since you just mentioned Bill Hamilton, would you like to just say a little bit about who Bill Hamilton was?
Yes, he was an English biologist who was a great entomologist. He was a very deeply thoughtful, reflective man. I think rather like Darwin in that respect. He has been called by some people Darwin's greatest successor of the 20th century. That's disputable. But, I mean, Fisher would be another candidate for that. I would say Hamilton was Darwin's greatest successor in the second half of the 20th century. He looked at selection from a genetic point of view. He always asked himself the question, how would a gene improve its survival chances by acting in various ways? And he pretty much laid out the whole theory of kin selection, but lots of other things as well. I mean, he made major contributions to this theory of sex ratios, to the theory of, to the introduction of game theory into evolutionary biology, into the theory of evolution of sex, why we have sex, sexual selection. He was an immensely fertile mind, constantly throwing off ideas which he would bury deep in paragraphs in other papers. You had to sort of, ferret your way through them. I was once having a conversation with him about the evolution of eusociality, true social behavior, in termites, which are rather different from ants, bees, and wasps. And he was praising the theory of, I forget the name, I'll just say X's theory of the evolution of termites. And I said, but Bill, that's not X's theory, that's your theory. You proposed that 7 years ago in your paper in, I forget, I mentioned some journal. And he said, no, that was X's theory. So I said, no, it wasn't. And I ran to the library, which was just close by, fetched the relevant book, opened it and said, look, it's your theory. And he looked at it and he said, oh yes, it does appear to be my theory after all. But X expressed it better, he said. So he had this sort of personality which you being English will know about Winnie the Pooh and
right.
He was Eeyore.
Eeyore, right, absolutely.
He had this sort of lugubrious melancholy. Yes. He was a dear man. He was devoted to science and to truth. It led him into all sorts of difficulties. He felt himself to be undervalued as a student, which he was. He was sitting on his PhD thesis in London was among the most important contributions to evolutionary theory of the late 20th century, of the second half of the 20th century. It was unappreciated at the time, more or less ignored at the time. And I think he felt done down by this. He sort of felt, not exactly bitter, but I think undervalued. He was immensely valued later in life. I mean, he died celebrated justly and loaded with honours.
Yeah. Now, I'm thinking about somebody else about the same period, just to close this, because there's a different response. That, you know, obviously there was George Price.
Oh, yes.
Another story. George Price, who played an instrumental role in some of the equations that were used to describe the inclusive fitness theory, kinship and so on, who took his own life because it was such a depressing view, allegedly.
Yeah, I never met George Price. I mean, Bill Hamilton and John Maynard Smith were both close friends of mine and knew him well. It does appear he was very mentally unstable, and the story does seem to be true that he took his own life because he was so depressed by the implications of evolution for human morality. It seems to me a curious sort of reasoning, because it's quite clear that we don't, as a matter of fact, follow Darwinian dictates slavishly the way he might have feared. But with all sorts of stories told about him, and I think they're true because they were told me by people who knew him well. He took literally the injunction to sell all that thou hast and give to the poor, and he became completely poverty-stricken. I mean, sort of dressed in rags and sleeping in doorways and things, because he gave everything away. And Maynard Smith's story is that when they wrote what actually was, I think, the first paper on game theory as an explanation for less than all-out aggression, the game theory explanation for moderated combat, they had a model which was called hawks and doves. Well, actually, there were other things: hawks, doves, bullies, other things. But during the course of developing this paper, Price became so fanatically religious that he wouldn't use the word dove because he thought it was a sin against the Holy Ghost. And so, in that first paper, dove was actually changed to mouse. It was hawk and mouse. Wow. Later, Maynard Smith restored it to dove, and that's the way we now know it. It's become known throughout the literature as hawks and doves.
Yeah. How do you explain this thing? I noticed that, I mean, interviews that have been done with you, many of them, but they have a common thread.
Yeah.
And I've known you for a while, so it's I'm just curious to know how you respond to this. I mean, here's one. I feel uneasy approaching Richard Dawkins' house in Oxford. The strange thing about reading his latest book, this was The Devil's Chaplain particularly, is that I agree with virtually everything he says, but find myself wanting to smack him for his intolerance.
Well, I'm not the best person to... I mean, I think there's a difference between arguing robustly against somebody and being intolerant of them. I mean, I guess intolerance is refusing to listen or not bothering to argue because you just sort of simply think they're beyond the pale. I suppose I occasionally do that, but who doesn't when you're faced with some of the provocation which one occasionally gets? Yeah. But if somebody is honestly interested in working together to get at the truth, if they're ignorant, and we're all ignorant of something, I mean, you know, we're ignorant of most things, I'm very, very happy to have a discussion with anybody, which I hope is amicable. I think if they're, if I feel that somebody is wantonly and deliberately deceiving because they've got some sort of agenda, I might be intolerant of that. And Maynard Smith, whom I greatly admire, who was extremely good with students, with anybody who genuinely wanted to know. I've seen him go red with anger at a creationist who he detected, he caught out in using deceptive tactics to mislead students. I suppose I'm a bit like that.
I mean, don't you sort of get up to here at some point with, and why do you keep on talking to these folks? Because
well, I don't usually talk to
frustrating.
I talk to people who genuinely want to know, who genuinely want to discuss and discover. And I mean, last night at the Nuremberg lecture, they're quite unusual actually. A gang turned up. I mean, a clique. They filed in single file, with Bibles under their arms, all sat in a row. And then when came for question time and people were asked to queue up behind a microphone, they just all, one after another. I mean, they completely monopolized the microphone. That was unusual, and I usually try to answer robustly, but I hope courteously. I think I did lose it once last night when the Hitler-Stalin question came up, which I've just had so many times. It's such a stupid question, and yet over and over and over again they trot it out.
Oh, the false...
I mean, so, you know, Hitler and Stalin did their terrible deeds in the name of secular humanism.
Yeah.
I mean...
Because they were atheists.
Yeah, well, Stalin was, Hitler probably wasn't, but anyway, it's irrelevant. They didn't do it in the name of secular humanism, and there is no possibility of doing it in the name of secular humanism. Why would you? I mean, how could you logically derive violence and killing from secular humanism? You easily could derive it from Nazism, which Hitler did, or indeed from certain religions, as we know only too well today.
Mm. The campaign on the English buses, could you speak
It's a bit
to
of a joke. I mean, it was started by a young woman called Ariane Shereen, who was provoked by pro-religious bus advertisements. I think they said something like, if you don't believe in Jesus, you'll go to hell, or something like that. And so she wanted to run a counter-campaign, which was much gentler than that. Her campaign said, there's probably no God. Now, something like, stop fretting and enjoy your life, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So she put a piece, I think it was on the Guardian website, appealing for money to pay for a campaign of advertisements on buses. And she knew she needed £5,500 to get 30 buses for 1 month. And she actually got, I think, £100,000 in 2 days, almost all from small subscriptions. Before I knew about all these small subscriptions coming in, I agreed with her that I would put up a matching grant of £5,500, which would mean that if everybody matched, if it was matched, we get £11,000. And in the event I needn't have bothered, I mean, the money just poured in. Mm-hmm. £10 here, £5 there, £15 there. It was a spectacular success, a genuinely popular movement. I'm now rather regretting I made my matching offer because it wasn't necessary. And it's not that I begrudge the money, it's just that I'd have liked to be able to say this was a purely grassroots campaign, which it almost all was.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact reference now, but isn't there an edict against your website, your richarddawkins.net?
In Turkey?
The Turkish
yes.
people have been told not to go there.
Yes. It seems that there's an odd loophole in Turkish law, such that if any citizen goes to the authorities and complains about a website, it's instantly closed down while they investigate it. I think that's the way it works. Yeah. You'd think they leave it open while they investigate it, so it was achieved by this really dreadful man, Harun Yahya, whose real name is Adnan Oktar. He looks like a sort of James Bond villain. I mean, you look him up on Google image, and you see this extraordinary figure on a yacht with a sort of a glass of champagne or something, maybe teetotal, I don't know, with a white suit and looking just like the sort of villain of a James Bond film. I think he's in and out of prison all the time. He's certainly under suspicion of all sorts of terrible things. And he's the one who wrote this astonishingly big, fat, coffee table book.
Oh, the one that was sent around?
Which sent round free to all. That means there's a colossal amount of money there, because this is a very, very high quality production, not high quality content, but high quality production book with glossy pictures. At least, I don't suppose he's paid any copyright fees for any of those pictures. I mean, there's no acknowledgement of any copyright. I imagine they've all been just ripped off. But it is a very expensive book to produce. It's been sent around free. It's full of elementary zoological howlers. I mean, the theme, every page of the book has a fossil, and then it has a modern animal. And the fossil might be 200 million years old, then there's a modern animal, and the message is, see, they're just the same. So evolution hasn't happened. In a few cases, they are just the same, but which means that, you know, evolution does sometimes slow down. I mean, there are living fossils. But there are other cases where they're nothing like each other. I mean, there's a case where the fossil is a crinoid, a sea lily, and a echinoderm, a sort of stalked sea urchin. And the modern animal that's pictured very clearly beside it is not an echinoderm at all. It's a sabellid worm. It's a tube-dwelling annelid worm. You couldn't get more different if you tried and still remain an animal. I mean, these are different major subkingdoms of the animal kingdom. There's another one which has a fossil eel, and then the modern so-called eel, which is it's a snake. It's a water snake. It's this common water snake you see if you dive almost anywhere in the tropics. The one with stripes across. Mm-hmm. But the champion one of all is that there's a caddis fly in amber as the fossil, and the modern so-called caddis is not an insect at all. It's a fishing fly, an artificial fishing fly with a hook sticking out of its backside. That's actually been removed from the latest edition of the book, because he must have been so embarrassed by it. And he's now trying to pretend it was never there. But there it is, and there are numerous other such howlers.
Okay, so why? One question would be, why don't the four horsemen of the apocalypse, so-called, that's you, Sam Harris, Chris Hitchens, Dan Dennett.
Yeah.
Why not just sort of say, this is so silly, and just let it go? Because it's been quite clear from some of the tone, and I've spoken to Sam obviously about this, and we've done the Beyond Belief meetings, as you know, that at least what appeared to be part of the strategy was to say we have to take a full offensive to the whole notion of people who are subscribing to a religious point of view, and that that moderates, even just people who just like going to church, like singing the songs, like the architecture, like the music, have to be shaken out of their...
Well, yes. Strategy is an optimistic word to use. I mean, there was no strategy as far as I'm aware. We certainly never discussed anything, and I don't really think I had a strategy. One can sort of, with hindsight, invent what might have been a strategy, and it's not a bad one when you think about it. I mean, being nice hasn't worked for decades. Right. And independently, without any collusion, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, and I, in our different ways, came out rather more, well, Dan actually was rather more gentle, I think, than the other three of us. And I think that we probably have had an influence which our nice predecessors manifestly failed to do. So I think it's nice to be nice, and that there are other people who adopt that policy, but I think there's also room for people like Sam and Christopher and me.
A little in your face.
Yeah. In a good-humoured way. I mean, we're often accused of being shrill and strident and things, and those are nearly always, those adjectives have become so ubiquitous that they almost can't see our name written down by a religious person without being preceded by that. I actually think, I mean, I like to think that The God Delusion is actually quite a funny book. I mean, I think it should make you laugh. It's certainly not strident.
What about the people who criticise the theology and the so on and so forth? I mean, that wasn't...
Well, as I said before, I don't think theology is a subject at all. So, I mean, one should no more be criticised for neglecting theology than one should be criticised for neglecting fairyology when you say you don't believe in fairies, or for neglecting astrology when you want to say that you're an astronomer and you don't take astrology seriously. You don't actually need to learn up the niceties of the study of fairies in order to say you don't believe in them. If somebody wants to believe in fairies, the onus is on them to produce some evidence that they exist, and the same goes for God.
Okay, so what's your current position then for the? I mean, today happens to be first day of Passover. Next week it's going to be Easter Sunday. There's going to be droves of people engaged in what you would say is a non-subject, essentially.
Well, I mean, you yourself said there are people who enjoy singing the songs and enjoy ritual and things, and I've no problem with that.
Yeah, this is a nice book that you probably know, Angels and Ages by Adam Gopnik, which is a sort of his Darwin and Lincoln book, and he has some. It's a wonderful book about Darwin as well, but he also makes the point, and I'm just using him as an example. Even if we mean by religion what most people have actually meant by it since the beginning of time, an encompassing practice of irrational rituals that can't be justified, but only experienced and given order and continuity to life, then of course religion is compatible with Darwinism. Because in a sense, it's the epiphenomena of religion, the choral music, the stained glass, the communion are the thing itself.
Yes.
It's kind of...
Well, yes, but then it's trivial, isn't it? I mean, it's just like, you know, you enjoy music, that's fine. But I mean, religion, for most people, does make actual existence claims. It actually does make claims on the universe. That's where I have problems with it.
Right.
That's one of the many places I have problems with it.
But so you don't have a problem with people, because the sense that one had of this, in hindsight, was there a campaign and a strategy, was that the people who did go and sing the songs and go to the church and so on were somehow aiding and abetting the people who fly into and knock over buildings.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I don't think that going to church and singing the hymns does that. I do think that there is a sort of aiding and abetting in people who say things like, if you have faith, then you can be justified in playing out that faith. I mean, somehow treating the idea that faith is a virtue. There is no virtue in believing in something because of private revelation, or because of tradition, or because some authority figure tells you, or because you just simply have faith in it, because you've been brought up with it, say. That's not a good reason to believe anything. And if you teach children that is a good reason to believe something, then you are aiding and abetting, because then if they believe on faith grounds, on revelation grounds, that it's the right thing to do to be a suicide bomber or something, we don't have an argument against them. They can simply say, oh, that's my faith, you can't touch that, you can't argue against it. I don't have to justify it, faith is enough. I think there is an aiding and abetting element there from those people who are themselves moderate, but who preach the idea that faith is a good reason to believe something.
So what do you do? I mean, with the people who were there last night, for example, I mean, you could certainly argue with the person who said, I'm bringing my children up as Christians and so on and so forth, but...
well, those people would have been unreachable, but there could have been lots of other people who hadn't really given it very much thought, and who assume, well, I might as well bring them up Christian, everybody else does, you know, but it doesn't seem to have done me any harm. You might give such people second thoughts.
If you hadn't been a scientist, what would you have liked to have been?
As a child, I was obsessed with music and with all musical instruments. I gravitated towards, if there was a musical instrument in the room anywhere, I'd gravitate towards it. But I never practiced hard enough to become a good musician.
But do you play something now?
No, I mean, I can. I've got a natural ear for music, which is of the kind, it's melodic, not harmonic. It's the kind that if I can whistle a tune, I can play it on an instrument without thinking any harder than I think about how to whistle it, practically. But that's not necessarily a virtue if it leads you, as it did in my case, to neglect the hard graft of practicing. It was so easy for me to just use my melodic ear to play that I never bothered to learn to read music, and so I'm no good at it. then I became, at various times in my life, I've been obsessed with computer programming. And that really is a vice, that's an addiction, which I've shaken off for the moment. But I think I could easily have imagined a career doing that.
I remember ages ago when we were at Caltech, you were then working diligently on those
yes, that's right.
computer programs.
Yes,
yeah.
I was, yes. I spent a fortnight in the Apple Computer had a little branch office in Los Angeles, and I worked there every day. It was one of the most productive fortnights of my life, I think, surrounded by expert programmers whom I could ask for their expert advice.
But you no longer make your own
No, I don't.
slides
No.
and stuff. If you, anywhere in history, but not Darwin, this is because that's too obvious an answer, I mean, who would you have liked to have had a conversation with? And you can say Darwin if you wish.
Well, I'd be quite curious to have a conversation with Jesus, actually. It would be very interesting to hear what really happened. But I expect he'd have just been a fairly ordinary sort of contemporary equivalent of a hippie. It probably wouldn't have actually got much out of him. I don't know.
I haven't read the book yet because it's not actually out, but Robert Wright, of course, who wrote The Moral Animal and then Non-Zero, has a book coming out called The Evolution of God.
Yes.
And there was an excerpt in The Atlantic, and it deals a lot with Paul and Paul's
Yes.
Globalization
Yes.
efforts. I mean, you know this argument and so on?
I haven't read the book, no.
No.
You do say when's it coming out?
I think June, a couple of
Yes,
months
okay.
from now. So. Do you have the sense that it was an enterprise? That
Paul,
is,
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always understood that Christianity is pretty much Paul's invention. I had an ancient history colleague in New College, a very distinguished ancient historian, whose lifelong quest it was to discover who was the greatest shit of all time, Plato or St. Paul, and he could never decide the answer.
What would be the argument against St. Paul?
I don't know. That Plato was even worse, I suppose. I don't know.
So, the current global situation financially. Last week, David Brooks wrote a column in the New York Times in which he discussed whether this was stupidity or greed. And both of these things are approachable from a neuroeconomics perspective. In other words, you can start looking at these from a more scientific perspective, and you could even bring in some cooperation, trust issues, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these things can be addressed with some of the science that's beginning to be developed. Do you think that will ever happen in terms of the way in which societies are held together currently by religious forces?
I do feel very diffident about venturing into a field so far from my own. Might surprise some people. I actually am not arrogant enough to venture an opinion on economics, certainly not on the current economic crisis, whether it's greed or stupidity. I haven't any idea.
Right.
On the more general question of whether a scientific approach to economic decision-making it would be valuable, I can't believe it wouldn't be. I mean, I can't imagine that it would ever do any harm to try to investigate such things scientifically. But it's way beyond my expertise.
So, all right, but after God, then what? I mean, what do you have a particular topic in mind to work on next?
Well, my plan after this book is finished, The Greatest Show on Earth is finished, is to write a children's book on science and on how we know about what is scientifically true, and to contrast it with myths. My idea is to contrast a mythological view of each question in turn. You know, what is man? What is the sun? How old is the earth?
Yeah.
It's who was the first person, and so on. And to show that myths are interesting and poetic and fascinating. To sort of lose the Judeo-Christian myth in the middle of a lot of other myths, so that to show there's nothing special about it, and then to come on to the scientific answer to whatever the question is. So it'd be a series of questions, beginning with mythological answers and then going on to the scientific answer.
The children thing comes up a lot. I mean, one of the most vigorous things you've ever written, and one of the things that I see you react to most strongly is encapsulated in Letter to Juliet,
yes.
which is the letter to your daughter.
Yes.
I mean, was this a sense of her being disenfranchised or something? What was?
Yes, I think that I didn't want to indoctrinate her, and never did. But
she was how old at the time?
10.
Sorry, 10.
I wanted to show her the power of critical thinking, to show her that there were good reasons for believing things and bad reasons for believing things, and the good reasons for believing things have all got to do with evidence. And it's not easy to filter out the evidence, but I was trying to encourage all children, when they're told anything, to think about what might be the evidence for the thing that they're being told, and to be suspicious of anybody who tells them something which cannot be backed up by evidence.
Were you successful? What is she doing now?
She's a trainee doctor. She's a medical student, and doing very well.
And not going to church every Sunday?
No.
Right. Who's the smartest person you've ever met, do you think? And who's the wisest?
Are these questions you ask everybody?
Yes, they are. I'm sorry. It's a bit.
Okay.
And occasionally I get some interesting answers.
I'm kind of embarrassed to answer that, because I sort of feel it would be unwise
Selective.
of me to when all the people that I've met, I mean, I've met close colleagues that I've known for years and talked to on a daily basis for some periods of my life, who I might think of as the smartest person I've ever met. But then I've also met, Nobel Prize winners for 5 minutes, and so I think I'm going to pass on that.
Right. Are you surprised that there's still this enormously vigorous response from people about the God delusion? I mean,
well, there are responses, positive and negative.
Right. But I mean, it's been the biggest seller of your books, right?
Yes. Well, The Selfish Gene has had 30 years to sell in, and still sells very well every year. So it's possible the total sales are greater. In fact, I think they probably are. But it's certainly the fastest selling of my books, yes. The God Delusion is. I don't know. I mean, it's perhaps it's rather a good book. I don't know.
Yeah. Is there any discovery that you wish you'd had made, or are you happy that with the extended phenotype you always describe as being your best piece of work? I mean,
well, I'm sure there is. Yes. I mean, there are many discoveries that I admire, but I wouldn't really aspire to have made them.
Yeah. So. Next year is the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society.
Yes.
It's an opportunity, as we've discussed, to talk about the sort of fact that we're living in a world that Francis Bacon essentially predicted and described to some extent. And the traders on his mythical island in the New Atlantis, if you remember, the commodity that they dealt with was light, the light of understanding. So, in a sense, scientists could be described as merchants of light. And we have a 350-year enterprise going on, at least, although there was this scientific revolution leading up to that and so on. How do you think it's done so far?
I think it's magnificent. I mean, I hardly need to say that in my own field of biology, it's been transformed first by Darwin, and then by the whole of biology since, which has been underpinned by the Darwinian idea, culminating in the second half of the 20th century with the molecular genetics revolution, which is just spectacular. I mean, the idea that you turn genetics into a branch of highly accurate digital information technology Darwin would have loved it. But also in physics, I mean, the progress of physics since the start of the Royal Society, spectacular as well. With Maxwell and Faraday and Maxwell and Newton and Einstein and the quantum theory revolution. I visited twice the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, and both times was more or less literally moved to tears by the colossal enterprise of cooperating humanity, different languages, different nations, all driving towards the same cooperative end of producing this possibly the largest machine ever built, and all designed to uncover the nature of the universe, merchants of light, indeed. And I didn't think of the phrase at the time, but I was moved to tears by it. I was moved to tears similarly when visiting the Mount Palomar Observatory, and feeling that these instruments had been used to gaze out through immense distances and back through immensities of time. I think that the scientific enterprise is possibly the thing that humanity has the most cause to be proud of.
Richard Dawkins, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.